Hi, Misha here, and I teased this rifle a bit in my recent video looking at the STG-58, the Austrian FN FAL, and it kind of occurred to me that I've not really done a video focusing exclusively on the FN model 1949, also known as the FN49 or the SAFN, and a few other names besides. So let's correct that today. These are my two examples. On the top, we have an Egyptian contract in 8mm. And on the bottom, we have an Argentinian naval contract converted to 7.62 NATO 308. These are the two I own right now, but in the past, I've had other Egyptians. I've had two Luxembourgian. I've even had a Venezuelan. And those are gone now. So there will be a bit of story time in this episode as well, talking about why these are the two I own now. And yeah, just kind of getting into what many refer to as the grandfather, although truly father, of the FN FAL. And many consider it to be kind of a rifle past its time and all that. It's not exactly true. FN knew what they had and what they didn't have. No, it was more of an interim, a stopgap measure until the FAL was coming of age. But its roots, well, they lay way back before World War II and kind of go into wartime England, of all places. It's quite an interesting story. I will try to be brief because obviously I have no way to throw up cool pictures for you. So you can just kind of consider this a voiceover. Go to Google up pictures for yourself, and listen to me talk behind them. Or not, whatever you feel like. However, FN is a factory in Liège, Belgium. It started off producing Mausers and was, like many, a little bit dabbling in self-loading rifles before World War I. They even had a few concepts, but they didn't go anywhere, and of course World War I did not go well for Belgium. No, it wouldn't be until the 1930s they would revisit the self-loading idea, when Dudenov Saev would start working with short recoil guns between about 1931 and 1934. He tried them out, and much like others at the time, namely Tokarev in Russia, the short recoil system just didn't work out. So he switched over to a gas-piston system, gas-powered system. And in 1936, Saev would patent a new design, and then would create by hand the first prototype in 1937. Now, Saev had been kind of a colleague and understudy of John Moses Browning. Browning worked with FN, but it was an independent contractor. Saev was actually the lead weapons designer at FN Herstal, so he was part of the company. Between 38 and 39, the design would be evolved, and there are several pictures out there of early prototypes. It was almost ready to reach pre-production and the marketing stage. These early guns had a lot of the features we would later see, including using a tilting or tipping bolt that would lock in the rear. They also would use a long gas piston that would strike a carrier, making a short stroke system. And interestingly, they used a 5-round magazine. But they were lacking one critical feature that would actually hamper the design later on. In any case, in September of 1939, Germany, then Russia for that matter, invaded Poland, and FN kind of put the kibosh on new projects. Instead, it put all of its resources into building more machine guns and more bolt-action Mausers. Probably a good call. Either way, it wouldn't be long. In May of 1940, the Nazis would come and invade Belgium for a second time in 20 years. And of course, they would quickly take over the FN factory. I talked about that in the P35, the high power video, quite recently. Now, SAFN was ardently anti-Nazi. He fled, but not before first hiding or taking with him any documentation of his new rifle pattern. And that's probably for the good, because you might wonder why the Nazis didn't borrow it. They were kind of needing a self-loading rifle in 1940, 1941. Well, he made it where they couldn't find it. He would first just make his way to France. Of course, France would soon fall. And then he would make his way to Portugal. Then in the summer of 1941, he would cross the Atlantic and find himself in the UK, in England. There he would work with the Allies, including his self-loading rifle design, something that England didn't have. Of course, America had the M1 Garand, but England didn't really have anything. So in 1943, he worked on his concept, and like this one up here, these were chambered for 8mm Mauser. Why not .303? Well, the round wasn't well suited for a self-loading rifle. For one, it was a rimmed round. For another, it was kind of on the weaker side. It just wasn't the best suited. 8mm 7.92 just worked out better. And actually, there would be an order for 50 prototypes placed towards the end of that year by the Royal Small Arms Factory at Enfield, and the first would be ready in 1944, and they would enter initial testing and trials as the experimental Model 1, the Slim 1, however you'd like to say it, self-loading experimental model. Initial impressions were quite good. So much so that 2,000 rifles were ordered as kind of a troop trials run that year. However, it wouldn't be long before this order was canceled. That's why you're not going to find a British-produced FN49 type gun in 8mm, as cool as that would be. Now, a couple of things would happen that year. One, the war started to turn in favor of the Allies after D-Day, and it wouldn't be long, Belgium would be liberated, and SAFN would return to his home in September of 1944. Also, the experimental guns were having some gas issues, not terribly unlike what Germany suffered with the G43. Too little, too much, breakage of parts, just, poor regulation. So the design had some problems with this gas system, and the war was kind of being won, and the designer was back in Europe, so the whole project was basically canceled. In the UK, that is. But in Belgium, after SAFN helped kind of rebuild and restructure, FN found itself in a pretty good position in 1945. Well, sort of. On the one hand, Germany had been using the FN factory to produce guns, so it was in good shape. It wasn't terribly bombed or destroyed, so it was easy to get it back up and running for the Belgians. And they would produce high-power pistols, rifles, and they had a research and development department that SAFN would quickly get to work at, refining his design, something he's been on the path of for nearly a decade at this point. On the other hand, post-World War II, there were tons of guns available, either from the USA, or Russia, or even England. So where would be a market for a new gun, self-loading or not? Well, FN would think on this, and in the interim, SAFN would perfect his design in 1946, and the earliest prototypes were available in 1947, and so it would enter into the FN catalog. There were only two major changes from earlier models. One was a switch to a 10-round fixed magazine, meant to be topped off with chargers. And another is under the handguard here, an adjustable gas regulator, gas valve. It actually looks very much like what you would see on the FN FAL, and this kind of resolved several issues. It also has an adjustment up here to shut the gas off for grenade launching, what have you. Another benefit of having an adjustable gas system like this meant that it could be tailor-made or fitted for virtually any full-power rifle cartridge. While the earliest prototypes were in 8mm, post-World War II, Belgium was using 30-06, 7.62 by 63 Springfield because of the M1 Grand, Uncle Sugar. So it could work for that. It could work for 8mm. It could work for other things. For example, 7mm Mauser. So they did start marketing the gun. And they thought a good target would be the unaligned nations, what would become eventually the Third World. There were plenty of nations that really didn't want to accept military aid from either the West, US, or the East, the Com Bloc, Soviet Union. Because if you take a gift from them, well, that kind of draws you into their sphere of influence. Plenty of nations just didn't want to get involved, either in South America or in Africa, where colonization was just now breaking apart. For example, India was a major leader in this movement as well. Heck, even Yugoslavia took part in it. So this was the target that FNH was going for. And since the rifle could be rechambered for virtually any cartridge, FN was happy to customize to suit the needs of potential buyers. Now, before we get into the contracts here, they were not dumb. The FN FAL was already in its early stages at this point, and the major differences: it would be fully select fire, it would have a pistol grip, yada yada. Now, the FN49 was in the catalog basically to get FN back on the map. They'd been, of course, World War II. It put them back around, and it would generate cash. This was always meant to be an interim measure, interim solution. Yeah, the design, a full-length, full-power gun, made a lot of sense in the 1930s when SAFN was first working on it, but by the late 40s, well, it was having to compete with the M1 Grand. Was it better than the Grand? Possibly. Many think so. But it wasn't a leap forward. That was meant to be the FN FAL, and that's where that story kind of kicks off. But this was an interim solution because they knew it would take them time to get the FAL going. And honestly, it was pretty darn successful. In total, they would build just over 176,000. Not a huge number, but better than 10. And they would build several variations for several contracts. Even if most were just samples, they would never be acted upon. So with that, yeah, let's talk about the nations that looked at the new rifle, sometimes known as the SAFN, self-loading or semi-automatic FN, or the FN model 1949, FN49. Heck, there was even a select fire version, yeah, still with the 10-round mag. So okay, picture time can end for you there. We'll get back and get to some nitty-gritty. Alright, let's move our Argentine away for a minute to look at the Egyptian contract here, which is a good example of an earlier pattern FN49. There are a number of minor changes and updates to the design we'll talk about in a minute. And I kind of like to think of this one as having a few holdovers from its brief time in England. For example, the brass butt plate with the round trapdoor, very infield style. If I can get up with my finger, it's tight. Unit disc, I don't know, this seems kind of very infieldy. Of course, Egypt had up until recently been colonized in a way by the UK, so yeah. Overall, the rifle is about 43.5 inches long, so about the same as the FAL. It does have a slightly longer barrel at about 23.25 inches. And it weighs about the same as the FAL at about 9.5 pounds unloaded. It has a 10-round mag. It is fixed. It can be quite easily detached for cleaning or maintenance, kind of like on a Mauser, but it's not meant to be done in the field. Instead, it's meant to be topped off with chargers up here. Nice stiff springs on this one still. Charger here. Yeah, put it in there. Let it go forward. There isn't a release as such, so on empty mag, you just gotta push the follower down. There are some neat features. For one, there's a cocked indicator at the front of the trigger guard here. Little pin that protrudes. It's not a loaded chamber indicator because this isn't a loaded gun and it still charges. You see it go up there. Here's our safety. The nice thing is when it's on, it physically blocks the trigger, so you're going to know your safety's on. Has a neat little sliding dust cover here. Reciprocating cocking handle. This one is checkered. We have an adjustable ladder rear sight. On the Egyptian guns, they would be marked in Arabic. Also have a crest on here, usually depending on the contract. Of course, it would change. These were applied in Belgium, even if they were for foreign sales. The front sight was set at the factory by height and put in there. Have a Mauser style bayonet lug, and the muzzle is threaded, but typically it's just covered with the cap, typically. Like I said, we have an adjustable plug here, either to remove to get the gas piston out, like on an FAL, or to switch it off for grenade launching. A clamp-on grenade launcher accessory was on offer by FN because anti-tank rifle grenades were very popular in Europe after World War II. And like I said, we have a short stroke, long piston here with an adjustable gas regulator to kind of resolve those issues. And comes apart here with a disassembly up top. Pretty conventional self-loading rifle. Had to stop there for a minute to mollify Miss Hobo. There's also, flipping it over, a control to hold the bolt back manually on the left side. Typically, if not always, they would have a phosphate finish covered up by a black enamel paint type. And originally from the factory, it would have wooden furniture made of walnut, typically with an oil finish. I believe it was linseed. And they would come with leather slings. Bayonets could either be of a long or short pattern, and were pretty much variations from FN's previous bolt actions. Now, the Egyptian guns were early, but actually the first contract was signed in March of 1948 with Venezuela, and it was for 4,000 pieces. But this was kind of a pre-order situation. The first Venezuelan guns wouldn't be delivered until May of 1949, with the balance delivered at the end of July of that year. And ultimately, Venezuela would buy a little over 8,000. And their guns are quite unique, and actually my first FN49 was a Veni. They were chambered for 7mm Mauser. They looked very similar, except they had a ribbed solid butt plate without a trapdoor. And they're really the only contract that took FN up on the offer to do a muzzle brake. The FN guns have a pretty distinctive muzzle brake, whereas pretty much all the guns had threaded muzzles. Yeah, the Venezuelans really were the only ones who liked the muzzle brake idea. Now, the Egyptian contract would start off slow. In May of 1948, under King Farouk, they would order 100 kind of test pieces. And these would be delivered a year later in 1949, and they would lead to a second contract that was much larger, delivered in June of 1950. And from there would be a couple of others. Egypt would obtain over 37,000 ultimately, as well as spare parts. And kind of interesting, the guns that were shipped from Belgium would have the crest with the crown on it of the king, but it's said that the ones that have the eagle on top were actually spare receivers sent over as replacement parts, and then they were used later to be built up into rifles. That's what's said anyway. So that was kind of the earlier contracts. Also, Belgium itself would become interested in May of 1949, ordering a very small initial sample batch of 30. And then towards the end of that year, they would order 100 more. And after these went through trials in 1950, they would order 6,000. Whereas the Egyptian guns were in 8mm, the Venezuelans in 7. This third contract would be in 30-06, 7.62 Springfield. And ultimately, the Belgian Army would have between 87 and 88,000. The Navy also used a few, as did some of the Belgian police. It's pretty famously known that it was known as the ABL SAFN 49 for the semi-automatic only. And yes, there was a select fire version known as the AFN 49, or just AFN, that Belgium did. It was the same gun with the same fixed 10-round mag, just select fire for whatever purpose. That sounds like a bureaucratic decision, if you ask me. From there, we had contracts from Indonesia, Colombia, Brazil, and up here. In 1953, one of the later nations to adopt the FN49 was Argentina. They would purchase 5,537 for their navy. Now, they actually obtained their first one back in 1949. They ordered one early on in 1948 from FN as a sample, but due to politics and whatnot, they would eventually get 3 more samples, bringing a total up to 5,541. And these would be delivered. Other purchasers would be, of course, like I said, Luxembourg would famously buy 6,306 in 30-06. And we would have the Belgian Congo. But by 1956, all outstanding orders had been fulfilled, and things were kind of winding down because the FN FAL was finally on the market and being shipped in quantity. So that kind of looked like that was going to be it. But in 1960, towards the end of that year, Indonesia would place one more order, which FN would use its existing parts to build and deliver in February of 1961, thus finally wrapping up construction. So there was a 4-year gap, almost 5-year gap in construction there of these guns. But of course they would remain in service. In total, FN would sell these to 9 nations that would fully adopt them, but they would make over 24 variants for different sample contracts. For example, they made 5 and 6.5 Swedish for that contract, which was eventually won by the AK-4, a G3 type. They would also make 1 and 7.5 by 54 French for a Syrian contract, which would ultimately be won by their own French design. And they would even do 1 and 7.62 NATO for a Brazilian contract that didn't go anywhere. But Argentina, they did take notice. So you have to wonder if that's what kind of inspired this version here. Originally, the Argentinian guns were chambered for 7.65 by 53. This was actually originally a Belgian round. It was first used in their 1889 Mauser, and then Argentina used it in its 1891 Mauser. Well, it's not a Belgian. Belgium was the first to use it. It was actually a designed by Paul Mauser. But anyway, you get my point. But the cartridge was getting obsolete in the 1960s, and so Argentina had the idea to rework and rechamber their guns to fire .308, 7.62 by 51, 7.62 NATO. This work was not done, the design was not even created by FN. Rather, it was done in Argentina by a private firm under contract. They would add a new barrel. They would also modify the extractor and ejector. And of course, they would famously switch them over to using detachable. I'll set you down for a second. .20 round magazines. These are proprietary. They do have a bolt hold open in the back here. You would think they would make them take FAL mags, since Argentina would use the FAL, but I think the shape of the receiver here and bolt and all that just didn't make it practical. Instead, they reworked the trigger guard, they added a mag release here, and let them take detaching mags. Quite interesting. I don't know how many of the 5,500 some odd Argentinian guns were converted and how many were left in the original caliber, but since you don't really find many 7.65s left, I would imagine the bulk were converted over. It's also, again, worth pointing out that the Argentine guns, since they were relatively late contract, have relatively late features. And while the gun had no major changes or no major variants, there were several minor ones. Based on the contract, the butt plate could be different. Like I said, this has a small round door that opens vertically. This has a larger door that opens horizontally. So you can find that as a difference. Another thing I'd note, this has a checkered cocking handle. This has a much smoother one. It also seems, yeah, this is a little bit longer. This is a little bit shorter. The disassembly here, this is kind of a piece of spring steel. This is a much beefier latch back here. The rear sight / top cover is also slightly different between the two of these. Not just the markings change, but they altered it. They added this little thing in the back here. This doesn't have. Little changes like that kind of crept into the design. There's at least two types of thread protector. Like I said, there are two different lengths of bayonet on offer. But the biggest change came in 1952. Originally, there was a single piece long firing pin, but that was prone to breaking or sticking. So SAFN worked on a two-piece firing pin, which appeared in later models and was sometimes retrofitted to earlier ones, although it did require reworking the bolt. Also, oddly, a lot of guns have an out-of-battery safety, but some, like the Egyptian, it was omitted for whatever reason. Maybe they were worried it would get clogged up in the dust or sand. Don't know. So a few internal changes. There was never a shorter version, carbine version with a shorter barrel, no folding stock version. But there was a sniper version. FN would make about 750 and 30-06 as snipers for the Belgian Congo, and a few others. And these would be fitted with various 4-power scopes, typically with scope mounts obtained from the USA. Egypt also had a few snipers. They had a 2.5-power scope sourced from Czechoslovakia because they had a pretty close relationship with them after the deposing of King Farouk when Nasser came in. I don't think FN originally made these as snipers. I think these were done in Egypt, but I could be wrong. There's also a variant made for Egypt that had 3 sling swivels, or 2 sling swivels and a stacking swivel if you prefer. And that turns up from time to time. Kind of interesting. But all in all, the design was pretty unchanged from beginning to end, because it was a relatively short production run. So that kind of gets us through the variants, most of the contracts, at least the broad strokes, and some of the alterations. So after all that, did this thing even see combat? Yes, it did. One reason that the Belgian military was ready to adopt it in large numbers in 1950 was the Korean War. They were part of the UN, the NATO actions there. So as soon as they were able to obtain them in any numbers, they shipped their 30-06 examples over to Asia, and they went up against the SKS and PPSH-41 and other guns, and they fought alongside the M1 Garand, which actually led to a lot of comparisons between the new FN49 and the still modern M1 Garand. And in most instances, the FN49 came out on top. Although some didn't like its 5-round stripper clip loading versus the 8-round on-block loading of the Garand. Weight and size-wise about the same. So Korean War use. The Belgians would continue to use them in the Congo, as would the Belgian Congo, of course. So quite a bit of action in Africa, and as guns do in Africa, once used one place, they kind of spread elsewhere. Egyptian guns, while the contract was over and they were switching over to the Hakim and eventually the AK, they were very much in service in 1956 during the Suez crisis, the canal crisis, in the Sinai there, and they were used quite extensively. And they would continue in Egyptian service through at least the 6 Days War, which was in 1967, and some could have been kicking around still in 1973 during the Yom Kippur War. At any rate, Egypt certainly used them. As far as Argentina, they went to the Navy, so they didn't see a lot of actual combat use, although some were issued in combat during 1982 during the Falklands War with Britain. In fact, some sources claim they were used as DMRs because it was felt maybe they had a little better accuracy compared to the FAL in service at the time. Who knows? But they were used there. So they kind of bounced around a bit. I did see some combat, more than others. After the Falklands, they would be more or less retired in Argentina. And in Belgium, they would be kept in second-line service throughout the 1980s, kind of finally retired out completely by the end of the decade. And much the same in Egypt. By the 1980s, they were very much declared obsolete. And in other nations like Luxembourg, Venezuela, they were pretty much out of service by the 1960s. So with that, let's talk about why these are the two that I own today, why I sold my other ones, and how these got into the USA, because it's kind of an interesting story in and of itself. This is the mag pouch I've been using for the Argentine mags. They're a little too big to fit in an FAL pouch, unfortunately. Very long. They have a spacer in the back for the shorter cartridge, but still they need to fit into this receiver. That's the thing to note too. Things like receivers were made pretty much by custom for each caliber. So, why and where? The first ones to come in the USA were back in 1958-59, and they were Egyptian. During the Suez crisis, the Israelis would capture not an insignificant number from Egypt. And then just a couple of years later, Interarms would purchase quite a few guns from the Israelis, including the FN49. So these were the first ones to ever hit American shores. Keep in mind this was before import markings were required. Moving into the 1960s, between 64 and 67, you started to see pretty large numbers of Venezuelan and Luxembourgian as well as some Colombian and a handful of Brazilian guns come in. This is pretty much where all the Luxembourg guns went, so they were out of service there. But in 1968, the Gun Control Act not only required import marks, it made it very difficult to bring over surplus guns. So throughout the 70s, we got virtually no FN49s because it wasn't sporting. Oh dear. But the rules would change in the mid-80s, and so surplus guns would flow once more. And by this point, the Egyptian guns were out of service, and Egypt itself was much friendlier with the USA. So we started to see another round of Egyptian guns coming in the mid and late 80s. And from there, the first Argentinian naval guns, and 308, as we would call it, came in 1995. But the problem was they were not considered CNR at the time. Therefore, they had to be modified to make them compliant with the new, at the time, federal assault weapons ban. These have a threaded barrel, they have a bayonet lug, and they were fitted with 20-round magazines. So to make them legal, they actually used cut-down mags to 10 rounds, and I've seen a few that had the muzzle cap pinned on. Keep in mind, 95 was also post-1989 Bush import ban, so yeah, they were kind of imported with quite a few strictures. But luckily, a second batch came over in 2003, and by this time, they were CNR and they were essentially grandfathered in. So this batch of Argentinian guns could kind of come over unmolested along with spare magazines. This is a proprietary mag, but luckily, since it only fits this gun and several came over, they're actually pretty easy to find, easier than you would think, and less expensive too. Egyptian guns would continue to come in, mostly by century. There's kind of a few odd things though. Some of them were fitted with stocks from other FN49s, and still others were fitted with stocks constructed by an Italian company for century. And even ones that had the original stock, sometimes the original butt plate would be replaced with a black plastic butt plate. No one knows exactly why this happened, but many surmise that the original stocks were too badly damaged, beat up. It's also worth pointing out that if the eagle-marked receivers were just stripped receivers, it's possible they just didn't have stocks for them at all in the spare parts. What is clear is Century pretty much bought everything they could get from Egypt, so some guns were complete, original, some had minor reworking, and some were major reworked. In fact, some of them even have a blued finish, which is not original. So if you see an Egyptian gun that's blued, that doesn't seem to be correct. Maybe something Century did. Not sure. Kind of a little ambiguity there. It also should be reminded that these were fired with corrosive ammo, so if you're going to buy one, always check your BOA and your gas system. And of course today, you really don't get fresh FN49 imports. Pretty much all of them that could come over did come over, and many were in great shape. The Venezuelan guns were really nice. The Luxembourgian guns looked almost unissued, at least the ones we got. The Belgian guns have never been imported in large numbers, and they probably never will be because of that whole select fire thing with the AFN. Even the ABL was created so that it could have this selector switch installed, and some say that's why the ATF will never let them come in. I'm not sure about this because they would be CNR, and in the past they don't care. For example, the M1 carbine, the SVT40 versus the AVT40, but who knows. Either way, the Belgians have not come in, nor have the Belgian Congo guns. So about the only 30-06 you can find are a handful of Brazilian, Colombian, and mostly the Luxembourgian, which are still tiny numbers. Now the most you find are the Egyptian by far, an 8mm, and the Venezuelan next to that in 7mm. The Argentine are quite uncommon. We don't really know how many are in the USA, but only a few thousand, because only 5,000 or less were ever made. But this was one I always really wanted. Just thought it was cool. I appreciate you staying with me this long. Sorry this video is a bit static. If it helps, I've been doing laundry while recording it, so what you're doing is probably more fun than what I've been doing. Just kind of running in here to do this in between. My first FN49 was a Venezuelan, 7mm. Pretty nice condition. I actually found it at the same gun shop, or about the exact same time I found my AG-42 Lungman. And it was really the same price, and I enjoyed it. I did take it out a couple of times and shot it. Very smooth shooting in 7mm Mauser, especially with that muzzle brake and the overall, 10-pound weight loaded. But it's one gun I sold when I started Ozark Bear Arms. That's what I had to do to kind of get things going, and someone offered me a very good trade. It's kind of a multi-part thing. I shipped the FN49, he shipped me quite a few M1 Garand stocks, M1 carbine, a couple of pistols, some other things. All told, when I sold all this stuff, I got 15, maybe 1,800 out of it, which was a lot of money back then, especially for a gun that I originally paid $500 for. Of course, now I know they go for probably more. The next one I really wanted to get, though, was this Argentine, and they've never been easy to find. And for whatever reason, I was having a hard time finding one 10 years ago. I always liked the Argentine FALs and thought a detaching 308 would be a neat gun. And I found this one. It was being sold with the bayonet, sling, and multiple magazines, a few other accessories. Ordered it, paid for it, price was good, and it came in with the stock totally broken here by FedEx. And the guy had packed it plenty fine, but FedEx obliterated it. Now I say totally broken. To be fair, it was like held on maybe 1/10 hit the back here, so it was kind of flopping up and down very sadly. Luckily it was a clean break, and luckily I had a gunsmith friend who was pretty good with fixing wood, and so he repaired it for me. I'm sure you can probably see the line, but at least he didn't have to go all crazy, and at least I didn't need to source a replacement stock because the number on the stock does match. Kind of a sad deal, but at least I got it back up and running. How it goes. After that, I kind of wanted to get an Egyptian gun because I ended up with a Hakim and then eventually a Rashid, and I thought the history was pretty neat for these. This is actually my second or third one. I've had several before because one of them was just kind of clapped out, another one the stock was a little funky, just kind of trying to find the right one. I've had them without import marks, but this one does have a small mark on the barrel, but on the flip side it's got a nice bore. I decided, you know what, tiny import mark, that's okay. I'd rather have a decent condition gun. And for an Egyptian, this is on the nicer side. Got a good strong spring in it. All the parts are here. Firing pin is not broken. One word, if you have a single piece firing pin, do not dry fire it. Not a good idea. In fact, if you really want to shoot it, you're probably going to want to get a replacement bolt with a 2-piece pin for safety's and reliability's sake. And if you have one of these and it's recoiling too much, that's what the adjustable gas system's for. To access it, just unscrew here, pull off the front of this upper handguard's 2 pieces, pull off the front piece, and you can directly access the regulator. I'm sure it was hidden to keep soldiers from messing with it. And for Egypt, that's good because it kept that mechanism protected from sand and dust and dirt. Plus, these are cool. Unit discs are cool. Now, I've also had a couple of 30-06s. One of them was a very pretty gun, all matching Luxembourg, nice finish, matching mag. Excuse me, well, the mag did match, yes, but matching bayonet. That was kind of the problem. It was too pretty to keep. It came out of a friend's collection that I bought, I really wanted to keep it. But again, you know, I do run a business and I do have my own bills to pay. It had to go, and it brought pretty darn good money. So it's just what it was. I kept other guns out of that collection, including a couple of Argentinian Mausers. So, you know, I can only keep a couple each time I do that. Otherwise, I wouldn't have a business that worked at all. I also found another Luxembourg 30-06 at the local Cabela's of all places. And they only wanted like $1,200 for it. And I talked them down to, I think it was $900. $950, and it wasn't as nice as the first one, but it wasn't beat up. It's kind of like this Egyptian here, this kind of condition. A few dings and dents, but the thing is, after having that first one as pretty as it was, the second one I just would not have been happy with as much, so I ended up flipping it, and I think it went for like 15, 16, good money. In the end, I don't really have these as shooters, so being 30-06, these I have for the mechanical interest and the historical. If I want to shoot a gun like this, I'm going to shoot my FAL, because the system, the piston, and the bolt itself is the same. Not that you can't shoot these, in fact, they're quite nice shooters, but no, yeah, I have them just because they're historically, mechanically interesting. Why not? And I've kind of kept these because this represents a relatively early pattern. This is one of the last military styles because of the Argentinian rework. And both had some combat history. Kind of neat there. I like that this was in the Falklands, or at least was around during the Falklands time. They also had M1 Grands converted to fire 7.62 under the BM59E name. Kind of interesting, that. And of course, I've done recent videos looking at the Hakim as well, which replaced this, but in turn was quickly replaced by the SKS and the AK. So, yeah, neat histories, nevertheless. So, yeah, what do you think? They're pretty cool guns, and extremely well made. I mean, FN, what else would you expect, frankly? But been kind of going over some of these old self-loaders. I like this generation. It was only around for about 2 decades, in between bolt actions and select fire, battle, or assault rifles. But these are true self-loading infantry rifles. M1 Grand is part of it, SVT 40, the Gewehr 41, the Gewehr 43, the MAS 44, 49, 49, 56, of course the Lungman, the Hakim. The SKS 2 could sort of be part of that, but the SKS is chambered for an intermediate cartridge. These are chambered for true full power, full rifle cartridges, so that's kind of what makes them different. It's a neat little snapshot in history. Many have equated it to kind of the last of the old world rifles, and I can see it. Really nice wood furniture, nice finish. Now, instead of being finely blued, again, they had kind of a paint over phosphate finish. It's before chrome lining was a standard, and it's even before detaching mags were a standard, really. Of course, with this one. But, yeah. The mag actually comes out pretty easily. Yeah, there we go. It's going to squeeze it good. These mags were all made in Argentina. The whole conversion was Argentinian. It wasn't an FN thing. But they did a good job. Well, guys, appreciate you hanging out with me, helping me get through while my laundry dries. Sounds like it's about done now, so guess I'll get to folding. Hope everyone's having a good day. If you could, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you would, check out some of my previous FN FAL videos. It's kind of a bit of a hobby horse of mine. And if you'd like to help support the channel, please check out the link to the Patreon page. This is Misha. Catch you very soon, hopefully with a little more activity next time. Thank you.